ask me, if I look around the world, which carbon pricing schemes do I like? I've got a lot of time to the California scheme. Not so to say I think it's perfect or agree with all the provisions in it, but if I were to look as a model to start building on, it would probably be the California scheme. Most schemes feature offsets, but always with limits. There's widespread shielding of emissions-intensive industry, like it or not. There is considerable momentum for carbon pricing in China, but all of this is still a long way enough to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with climate, and there is very much still to do. Good stuff will be fixing the EU ETS book. Okay, I think that's. Further details. In an entirely personal capacity, nothing to do with my Rio Tinto job, I've just started a website which is called On Climate Change Policy. Some of this is written up, and some of the charts you can find on that, as well as a bunch of other stuff. So, and those aren't written up yet, will be over the next sort of few weeks and months. So, as well as these slides will be on the UCL website. If you want to go there, you can find some of this stuff. That first chart on the step chart that's spread of carbon pricing is already on there, for example. Okay, that's all I wanted to say, and I think that leaves us some time for questions.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it does leave us time for questions. I was so keen to get to Alan that I omitted some of the normal starting remarks at an event like this, which is to say how it's going to go, and indeed who I am. So I'll now tell those of you who don't know who I am. I'm Paul Eakins, and I'm a professor at the Institute for Sustainable Resources, which is the sister institute of the UCL-Energy Institute. And we're going to take some questions now and see how it goes. After the questions, we will go upstairs and have some refreshments. But I very much hope that we're going to have some lively discussion first. So we have a question down here. I'll take them one by one unless a forest of hands goes up, in which case I'll ask you to make notes and we'll take them three at a time. But Will, you will first. Just like to introduce yourself so people know who you are. That would be helpful.
My name is Will McDowell. I'm a research associate at the Institute for Sustainable Resources. In a previous job, I worked in a part of the Canadian federal government advising on carbon pricing policy, which didn't go very far in the end, as you know. But my experience then was that an awful lot of the debate on carbon pricing policy was informed by a good deal of excellent theoretical work, but there wasn't actually much in terms of empirical evidence on the effectiveness of carbon pricing from the various schemes. And many of them were very young then. They're a little bit older now. And I'm wondering what you have in terms of, or what you've seen in terms of empirical evidence on the effectiveness of various carbon prices.
Well, as you say, they're still very young, and why I've talked principally about what's actually design rather than outcomes is that for most of these we only still see design. I can speak from a corporate point of view, which is you can very definitely see carbon pricing factored into investment decisions. It goes into spreadsheets. So, for example, I was involved in the purchase of Whitmore, my shareholder in our asset in a major asset in South Africa last year, and part of the price for that transaction reflected the prospective carbon tax in South Africa. Likewise, when we're looking at things happening in Australia, we factor in despite current political uncertainties, which we also have to take notice of, but for at least the next couple of years, we factor that in. So it certainly is affecting investment decisions at a sort of macro level. Firstly, it's enormously difficult to separate out the effect of the carbon price from all the other policies that are going on for carbon and elsewhere, and indeed general economic performance. I'm not sure you have a much easier job now than you would then. Maybe 5 years you will do.
There's a gentleman at the back. Yes.
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. Could you comment more on the role of offsets, in particular looking at the recognised supply chain vulnerability that forests, for instance, deliver water from watersheds, and the peatlands and the woodland codes that are being adopted in the UK on a habitat and landscape scale are all to do with carbon accounting in the UK. Is there a way in which these offsets can be included in a marketable index?
I would like to think so. Unfortunately, I think it's very difficult. It's been difficult enough to get carbon for land use, which is a global, completely fungible commodity, into a form where people will accept credits and so forth. When you've got biodiversity and water management co-benefits, which are very much local, and for which it's very difficult to establish any kind of market, because biodiversity in one place is really not quite the same as biodiversity in another place, and same with water. If it's difficult enough to do for an unambiguous global commodity like CO2, trying to do it for something extraordinarily local and diverse seems to be much more challenging. I do think this is an area which is getting and ought to get increasing attention, that as people recognise the co-benefits that are frequently there. But markets for ecosystem services are most charitably early stage. When I see how difficult it is to get carbon markets functioning well, I'm not that optimistic. But I think, to take what I think is implied by your question, should you recognise all the co-benefits of doing things like trees on watersheds? Yes. How you do it in a market sense is tough.
Gentleman at the front.
Eric Dears from the National Audit Office. I just wondered whether you'd like to talk about carbon leakage at all, because if you look, for instance, at the statistics for the UK, they show a reduction in greenhouse gases on a geographical basis, but DEC and definitely produced consumption-based statistics which shows us 12-14% above our 1990 baseline. And how does carbon leakage factor into your view, particularly from a big commercial company like yours?
Well, it's something we are naturally concerned about, especially having recently closed down a medium smelter in the UK. I think, firstly, leakage for a lot of economists is a bit of a red herring, but there is a proportion of emissions-intensive trade-exposed industry for which leakage is quite genuinely a major issue, because there is a major proportion of costs. And in that respect, carbon pricing can be inefficient in its economic signals. It can signal relocation of industry, which is inefficient. I think that though one of the reasons that everywhere pretty much in the world that carbon pricing has been introduced, some kind of allowance has been made for emissions-intensive industry, is precisely people accept the reality of the leakage problem. I think it was unfortunate that the electricity cost effect wasn't properly recognised in the EU ETS directive for phase 3. I would have liked that to have been written in at a European level, but it is a real problem. I think it's instructive if you look at one of the very few exceptions, which is the British Columbia carbon tax, which doesn't have leakage provisions. We have a large aluminium smelter in British Columbia, and that's okay because the electricity is all hydro, so there's no carbon pricing there, and process emissions, which are the other major source from aluminium smelting, are outside the scope of the British Columbia carbon tax, which is combustion only. As far as I know, there's a big pulp and paper company there, but they get a reasonably good break on recycling through corporate taxes. So even the exception, as it appears to be, which is British Columbia, they actually do recognise the problem, and in that particular case, it's not as severe a problem as you would think. There's a separate, the question of kind of imported emissions and so forth is a separate one. I don't buy necessarily the fact this will all be in the UK. It's only in China because we have carbon pricing here. In fact, by that logic, you would find the US exporting to China because they're increasingly China will have a carbon tax and the US won't. And that may happen, but it's because of cheap shale gas, not because of carbon pricing.
I think there's a gentleman there.
Yeah, we'll do my recommendations on a couple of things, Adam. First of all, you didn't talk about the size of the individual scheme, and that's important about the weighting effect of what you only touched upon it. And secondly, direction of travel for policy making is extremely important. So people can forward pricing policies and say, this is where we're going. If we have a 20-year timescale, where are we going to be?
I deliberately didn't talk about tightness of caps because that you then get into debate about what business as usual is, and that gets a bit politicised. I've seen a lot of business as usual graphs where kind of emissions going like that, where at that point there, just before they take a tick up, there's the introduction of carbon pricing scheme, so you've got large reductions relative to business as usual. On the long-term nature of certainty, I think that's one of the good reasons for having some sort of mechanism for adjustment in there. So, for example, in the California scheme, the price floor has a real terms escalator in there, so you know the price of carbon is going, the minimum price of carbon is going up in real terms over time. That's quite a helpful price signal. You could do it other ways, but certainly the volatility of prices under the EU ETS hasn't helped provide a stable investment signal, so I'd certainly take the point there.
Adam, can I ask a question? You've defined your carbon pricing pretty tightly there.
Yes.
There are a number of environmental taxes, which is one of my particular interests, which, particularly on energy, have been introduced for climate reasons, for emissions reduction reasons, but are not priced in carbon.
Yes.
If they were, have you done the calculations about the coverage? I mean, I'm thinking things like climate change levy, carbon reduction commitment, which applies outside the industry sector. I mean, if you look a bit more widely at these environmental taxes, then what kind of level of coverage might it be reaching there?
Well, quite a lot of that is in Europe, which, because this is emissions from the jurisdiction, not just covered emissions, you capture most of that anyway. It's in the EU emissions. You go into grey areas like there was a sort of carbon tax introduced in Japan last year, but it was by tweaking energy taxes and it was very low. It's not what I'd call a serious carbon pricing scheme. Likewise, I'm a bit suspicious about some of the CCL, not the carbon price at all, but some of the CCL as well. Likewise, there's a tax in India on coal. Is that a coal tax or is it a carbon tax? You know, it is a bit of a difficult boundary to draw, which is why I've been somewhat parsimonious in things which are clearly very explicitly targeting carbon in a serious way. Even then, you could make a case that Reggie so far has actually been rather low priced and had an already binding cap. And I was half tempted to leave Reggie out of this, but they're now looking at fixing it, so it seems it seemed worth including. But I was deliberately fairly parsimonious rather than drawing it more widely.
Fine. That's gentleman there. Then we'll go over to you.
Hi. Fraser Allen from DEC. I was wondering if you might be able to expand a little bit on the Alberta system, particularly the technology fund, and whether you think that kind of mechanism, I don't know exactly the restrictions on who's allowed to then access that fund, but whether you think that would more remove the incentives that the price creates, or whether it can help to create kind of a virtuous cycle of lowering the intensity.
I'm slightly more inclined to the latter. I'm just looking at my colleague from North America who's here today, Jeff Hopkins. Do you want to talk to that one, Jeff?
I think it's a good question. I guess more towards the latter as well. It's almost like, are you paying for future emission or current? It's really the R&D. It's a down payment on future payment.
And I think to answer your question, there is to me clearly a role for separate technology policies, and even if it's not funded out of that, and Alberta is doing some interesting things on CCS, for example, which it's funding directly, and that sort of penultimate slide I put on that carbon pricing isn't the whole story. Something like the Alberta Tech Fund, I mean, one could get into a more detailed discussion about that, is not intrinsically an obviously bad idea. You know, it has quite a lot of merit if done right and so forth.
It's quite large too. And the tech fund is large, and we're talking about tightening and increasing the price, and estimates are that the tech fund could even double at that point, so it's a significant amount.
The question was from Michael,
Well, we'll just go over there, and then we'll come to Mike.
Thanks. Approved Pave, also from DEC. In your concluding remarks, you said that you might want to fix the EU ETS, and I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on some specific reforms that you might want to see in the EU ETS to enhance its effectiveness.
Well, it's better if you don't start from here, and I would have started by having a price floor in the first place, which means we wouldn't go into this mess. I'm not sure backloading is enough. It clearly does require some permanent reduction in supply. There are various things you could do. So you can cancel some allowances. You can so without no particular order and with no particular balance, you want to think about cancelling allowances, setting a tighter, signaling a tighter, much tighter phase 4 cap. And difficult, but if you could move to argue that this gives you enough to move towards 30%, then so much better. But the short answer is backloading is not enough because it doesn't solve the fundamental oversupply problem. And the list of options the EU came up with would be perfectly sensible. Holt may disagree, but it's a perfectly sensible list of options. It's a shame the price floor debate isn't getting as much traction as my understanding is actually would be that hard to put an EU-wide price floor in, and I don't see any reason why you wouldn't want to do that, rather than sort of more ad hoc intervention. And there are some interesting thoughts and ideas around something that's a bit like an intensity cap, which I generally tend to be a bit sceptical of in some respects, because the environment doesn't care about emissions intensity, but where you could at least perhaps flex the cap in response to objective markers like GDP, which would solve some of the problems. And when I refer to Beijing looking at something a bit more like that, they've seen the EU experience and don't like it very much, considering something that is a cap, so isn't ex post determined by the level of output, but at least only a little while ex ante is influenced by the state of the economy and so forth. And that's another way to go, but it has to be some kind of permanent quantity solution.
Agree totally with your comments on the price floor of the EU ETS. I had, if I may, 2 quick comments and a question. One, just picking up Will's question about effectiveness. I do think the literature is still astonishingly thin. We now have 7 or 8 years of ETS. First estimate was that the first year saved 90 million tonnes. Was almost the only estimate in the market. But of course that was a year of almost 30 euros a tonne, and we've only had one other year like that. The bits that I see are it's saved somewhere between 200 and 500 million tonnes of CO2 attributable to ETS. Wouldn't surprise me if the uncertainties are even bigger when you look at both the positive but also the perverse effects of investment. With some numbers, more work would be pretty good. The other comment was on carbon leakage, where I just think it's an example of the tendency of where far too much analysis in the academic world has been sort of on the aggregate and thinking about efficiency, etc. Just have to remember, carbon pricing, the one lesson you learn is the old phrase, all politics is local. If you are in South Wales, you will not lose 1% of the South Wales steel plant. You will lose 100% or none of it. And that's what drives the politics of carbon leakage, because no politician is going to say, yeah, we're going to lose jobs, local industry, go to dirt, and you haven't saved any emissions. Right? So it's a very fundamental problem in the politics of any jurisdiction, and hence the result that you illustrated. Don't mind about it, that's the real world. The question is, what actually is the right solution? Our question is actually, where is this taking us? Every scheme you have put up is designed in a different way. That's the most astonishing thing. But we've got these great textbooks about global carbon price, OECD, wide ranging going. We've got a whole Pandora's box of different ideas and designs and structures and coverages and blah, blah, blah. You cover that brilliantly.
You saying that's not a global carbon price?
But what's your sense of where is this leading? Will we see serious discussions of linkage? We've seen one, which basically resulted in the collapse of the Australian carbon price.
Yeah, my perception of that was influenced by the particularities of Australian politics, which, for those of you who don't know, was are very peculiar. It's kind of Aussie rules politics. It's costs already several party leaders. And there I think that was almost the design, because one of the persistent objections to the Australian scheme was that the price was too high compared with the international level. When it was set, it was very sensible, because the EUA price was in the mid to high teens, and $23 seemed like a pretty sensible price. When the EU price went to 5, it didn't. So even the one example we've got so far is not encouraging. The second example, which is California and Quebec, which were all meant to be linked, looks like it now will happen, but a year or two late. It looks like it will now happen from next year. But that's in two schemes which were designed to be as closely as possibly aligned and linked. So I'm not optimistic, partly because of some of the debate in Australia where there has been concern about essentially subsidising European economies. We're buying allowances from Europe. We're subsidising European economies. To which my response is, well, we kind of need the money. But that doesn't go down too well when I say that. I think it's because the property rights will usually be regarded as national assets that any scheme which somehow sees national sovereignty over those property rights is going to be difficult. So while I'm kind of be 100% with anybody who suggests that more linking and more uniform price is desirable, I think it's going to be difficult to achieve. And the most baffling one for me is how they're going to get a national scheme in China when they've deliberately gone about designing 7 schemes, all of which different, so they can see what works well. I can only think they'll essentially, after 3 to 4 years, say, well, actually forget that, we've now got this one national scheme, and those will cease to have whatever form they start in. But when you've got, even in one country, 7 different ETSs, each which will have different designs. In Canada, now, even if you don't call China, Canada, you have carbon tax in British Columbia, a baseline credit scheme, effectively, hybrid type scheme in Alberta, Newfoundland, Labrador, and possibly Saskatchewan looking at copying the Alberta scheme, a different sort of scheme entirely at Quebec, and a performance standard for the power sector at the federal level. And that's in one relatively small economy. I feel more optimistic about a global carbon price. The only thing I would say is that although it would be highly desirable from an efficiency standpoint to get a global carbon price efficiency of abatement, in terms of competitiveness, except for the most emissions intensive and most trade exposed industry, some of this is not huge compared with, say, differences in gas prices between the US and Asia at the moment. So I'm a little less worried about some of the wider trade distortions. But yeah, it's a great idea, I'm not optimistic.
Okay, we're going to finish there because it's after our allotted time. I'm going to finish with one rather mischievous thought on the subject of the carbon floor price in the European scheme, because if the carbon floor price were introduced at, say, $15 per tonne with the current emissions price there, it will be a very effective way of introducing an EU-wide carbon tax without having to go through the unanimity requirement that a carbon tax would require. And we'd be back in the early 1990s when the European Commission tried to introduce a carbon energy tax but failed to get it through. So that would be a very highly desirable outcome in my view, and one that we can look forward to. Adam, thank you very much indeed. Very nice of you to come and display that expertise, and I'm very glad that we're likely to be working with you in the future. Thank you very much.